In 2020, Democrats took full control of Washington.
And it will give Democrats control of the Senate.
Joe Biden has been elected.
But Republicans stood up in the states.
There was no blue wave. Democratic down-ballot disasters carried all the way to the state legislatures.
Now, we're the last line of defense against the Democrats' socialist agenda. The ways we're fighting back are bigger than you think.
All right, welcome back to episode 18 of It's Bigger Than You Think, a conversation about the politics that most impact our daily lives. This is actually our first podcast episode back in 2022, and I am so excited to have Karl Rove joining me today, the man, the myth, the legend, Republican strategist, former White House deputy, chief of staff, and senior advisor to the president. Karl, I am so excited that you're joining us today.
You need to get out more often. You need to have more experiences in your life than podcast.
You are absolutely correct.
Yeah,
this
exactly.
is the only podcast I listen to, and it's because I make it.
Do it, exactly. Exactly.
Alrighty, so we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. The first topic that we're going to be talking about today is redistricting, because it's happening right now, and we're seeing Democrats gerrymander themselves more power in blue states. They're eliminating competitive Republican districts, and they're strengthening up their own. So can you talk about their hypocrisy when it comes to gerrymandering? It's kind of three-pronged, right? So there's the legislative map drawing, these so-called independent commissions, and also the endless liberal lawsuits in state courts.
Yeah, look, President Obama, after seeing what happened after the 2010 state legislative races and the 2011 redistricting, has made this the last several years the biggest thing that he's done politically since he left the White House in 2017. And he and Eric Holder have raised a lot of money, and they're spending it in state legislative races. And they cloak it in this, we're the people who are trying to only get fair maps. And then they, do what they did in Illinois, where they, screw the Republicans, or what they do in Maryland, where they, after 2011, the Democrats took out a Republican district in Western Maryland by spreading out the Republicans among several congressional districts and drawing that Western district into the Washington suburbs. Now they're going to try and get rid of the remaining Republican congressmen. So out of all of the members of the Maryland delegation, there'll only be Democrats. New York, they're talking about trying to take the Republicans from 8 to 3 out of the New York delegation. I mean, we've already got it anywhere where there's a Democrat legislative process dominated, the redistricting process is dominated by the legislature. I mean, does anybody think that there are no Republicans in Massachusetts? They get about, a quarter of the vote, and there are no Republicans out of their 9-member delegation. California, which is a so-called independent commission, after the first time they did it in 2011, the commissioners, after they wrote the map, which gutted Republicans, the Democrats on the commission went around openly talking about how they had jimmied the process in order to make it more Democrat. This time around, they held a celebration at the end of it to toast their ability to take the Republicans down in California. We get about 40% of the vote in competitive races, and they're going to take us down to just over about 10 or 11 or 12% of the total delegation. So, but the Democrats applaud themselves. We're there. That's just simply being fair. What if Republicans try and protect their advantage? Even in Texas, for example, where they could have done more, the Republicans have been urged to, basically kill a few more Democrat members of Congress, and didn't, because they wanted to minimize court challenges. Even then, they got no credit from the Democrats for having drawn the lines the way that they did, in a pretty even-handed way. So let's be clear about this. This is inherently a political process. Unless your state has one member, or your Iowa, where somehow or another they've avoided most of the partisanship for a great many decades, this is an intensely partisan process. And as a result, where the Democrats have control, they're going to do it to us. When we have control, we're going to do it to them. And that's just the way it's been for, several centuries. And that's the way it's going to continue to be, unless we take the authority away from people who can be held responsible by the voters, and instead put it in the hands of so-called independent commissions, which can be manipulated and often are.
So what can Republicans do to fight back against Democrat gerrymandering?
Well, one is where we have a legitimate case, go to court. I mean, we there are some standards that the Supreme Court has said this is an inherently political process. And so we're not going to enter into that. But there are some things that if they've done it wrong, we ought to hold them to account. But the main thing is run good candidates, and in close states or important states, make certain that you have the maximum power available at the time of redistricting. Too late for 2021 and 2022 when we'll finish the process. But it's a reminder of how important these state legislative seats are, because every 10 years they have a huge impact on the nature of the United States House of Representatives.
How do you think RSLC's success in 2020 kind of helped to shape this redistricting process?
Well, it was enormously important. I mean, look at it in Texas, for example, where in my old home state here, the Democrats fully anticipated that they would take the Texas House, led by a very aggressive House member. They had won a bunch of seats in the previous 2 cycles. They were within 9 seats of taking control. They poured an enormous amount of money, over $60 million, into state legislative races in Texas, and yet they came up short. They didn't make a single gain. They knocked off one of ours. We knocked off one of theirs. The Republicans held 83 seats. We've now picked up one Democrat whose district was carried by Donald Trump by 15 points. He won re-election by 16, but he saw the writing on the wall and said, I'm pro-life. I'm moderately conservative anyway, and I'd rather be over there with people who think my way rather than the people who are increasingly not thinking my way. But yes, RSLC did that across the country, whether it was North Carolina or Georgia or Pennsylvania or Michigan or Texas. It was critical to keeping Republican hands on the levers of redistricting.
We have razor-thin majorities in a lot of states, but a lot of people in the Beltway are saying that the midterms this year are going to be a major sweep for Republicans. What do you predict is going to happen in November?
Well, and we're going to win. There's no way of ands or buts about that. We're going to win the U.S. House. I mean, I teach political science in some spare time. Since the development of the second party system in 1818, there have only been 2 first midterm elections where the White House party gained seats in the U.S. House, 1934 and 2002. I happened to be around in 2002, and I know how hard it was to do that, even with 9/11, giving President Bush and Republicans a lift. So the Democrats are going to lose the House. The question is by how many? Now, I'm not one of these people who thinks it's going to be 2010 with 60 some odd seats, because there are 5 things that we look at. Presidential approval, lousy. That points to sort of the mid to high 20s. Retirements, that points to 40. A friend of mine, John Petrosic, former head of the government department at the University of Missouri, taught at UCLA before that, monitors this closely. And right now, it's the number of Democratic retirements would point to a 40 lead. Actually, a 40 seat loss for them. The other one is what we call surge and decline. Typically in presidential elections, the White House party gains seats in the House, a surge, and then loses those marginal seats in a midterm election. The problem for Republicans is that we had good news in 2020. We actually gained 13 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, 12 in November and 1 earlier in the special election in California. And so there was no Democrat surge. So the effect of the decline is going to be restrained somewhat. But if you take all 3 of those models and project them, they project a model of somewhere between 26 and 28 seats. And going from 213 and picking up 26 seats would get us to 239. That's a pretty good majority. And 240 would get us, one of the bigger majorities we've had in the modern era. So I think that's sort of where we're going to be. But there are 2 other models that we can't yet deploy to figure out what's going to happen. And that is fundraising, and most important of all, candidate quality, which is hard to quantify. Bottom line is the size of our victories is going to depend upon the quality of our candidates and the quality of their campaigns. And that applies not only to the U.S. House, it also applies down the line to statewide offices and to state legislative races. We're going to pick up a lot of marginal seats this year, but only if we have good candidates running good campaigns, and then they do everything they can to sort of solidify their hold on those districts between 2022 and 2024.
So what do you think is the number one indicator of whether Republicans are going to have a good year versus a great year?
Well, the cheapest and easiest one to look at is presidential job approval. And Joe Biden is the second most unpopular president in the modern era. But President Biden's approval rating is in the low 40s today. My sense is it's going to go a little bit lower. This inflation is going to bite. He looks weak on the international stage. He he's going to have some difficulties in his own party because he overpromised and underdelivered on the gigantic expansion of the welfare state, Build Back Better. And now he's overpromising on these two election bills, the John Lewis voting bill and the Freedom to Vote Act, which is basically federalization of elections. But the left is sort of invested in him. We want these things, and when they don't get them, it's going to cause some lack of enthusiasm over there on the hard left side of the party.
So what do you think is the messaging platform that Republicans should run on if they want to win in November?
Well, first of all, the most important platform is one that candidates actually believe in, because at the end of the day, people like authenticity. And so the most important message is to have one that somebody cares about. Take Glenn Youngkin. He actually cared about what would make the economy of Virginia better. Education, what would make, why was it that we were failing so many kids, and what did we need to do in order to prepare every child for a great life by giving them a quality education? He cared about the safety of neighborhoods and crime. So he talked about things that gave him credibility. And then when the issues sort of popped up at the end of the campaign with the critical race theory in Northern Virginia and rising crime in the cities across the Commonwealth, he was able to have developed a base where people said, you know what, that guy in the fleece, sweater or vest looks like a guy I can trust. So my point is, we need to have an agenda. We got to do three things. Really easy to say, we think Biden's messing it up and we'll be a check and a balance. It's a little bit harder, but still pretty darn easy to say, and here's what I think specifically he's doing wrong and why I think these things are wrong. But the biggest thing we need to do, and the thing that is critical to moving it from being a good day to being a great day, is to say, and here's what I think we need to do. And when I go to the state legislature or I go to the Congress, here's what are my priorities are going to be. Here are my values that are driving me. Here are the things I think we need to try and do. And sometimes, it's the authenticity of the candidate that makes the sale, not necessarily what it is that they have to say. We've got to have an agenda. If we don't have an agenda, we're going to win. We have an agenda, we're going to win bigger.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. And you mentioned Glenn Youngkin, right? And so his victory was a huge upset this year. The Democrats had gone all in. They lost the House, they lost the lieutenant governorship, all of it, right? So can you kind of talk about those victories in Virginia, especially with the suburban voters, and how that kind of like laid out a blueprint for success for Republicans going into this year?
Yeah. Remember, he wins by a couple of points in a state that Joe Biden won by 10, which means he had to get people who said, you know what, I voted for Biden for whatever reason, but I'm open to voting for the right Republican. And he made himself the right Republican. And so as we look towards 2022, we got to remember the seats in America that you can win by appealing to the Republican base and the Republican base only are insufficient for majorities in most states. You need to form a coalition of independent voters, some Democrats, and an overwhelming Republican turnout. And so part of it is organizational in nature, but it's also, Virginia taught us that you have to have an image and an agenda that causes people to say, I'm open to voting for a Republican, who normally don't vote Republican.
What's something that you think every candidate should be doing right now to ensure that they win on election day?
Well, I think there are three things they ought to do. First of all, they ought to make certain that they understand what their positive message is and spend more time talking about it than they do about we need to have a check and a balance on the Democrats, and here's what I think the Democrats are screwing up on. Those things are easy to do, and we ought to be really good at them. But they need to have an agenda. May not be as sexy as talking about we need to stop critical race theory, or by God, Biden is trying to spend us into oblivion, or he's weak on national defense. But we have to have an agenda that causes people to say, you know what, they're going to do something that actually affects my life and my family and my community. So that's one thing. Educate yourself on the issues, understand what it is that you want to advocate, understand how they're going to come at you on that so you can defend it, and then be courageous in laying that out. About the time that you get sick and tired of talking about it, the voters will actually wake up and pay attention. Second of all, raise as much money as you can and spend as little as you need to. And thirdly, pay attention to the blocking and tackling. One of the key successes in Texas in 2020 was we'd gotten away from it. When I came to Texas, we had had a brief period during which we hadn't elected a Republican governor. 114 years. I went to work in the Texas legislature for the senior Republican in the Texas House. There were 16 out of 150 members. Now, the state Senate was different. We had a 31-member state Senate, and the Republicans had had an incredible election and had increased their numbers in the state Senate in one election by 50%. They'd gone from 2 to 3 out of 31. And yet we came into the majority. And we came into the majority because every 2 years, we did a gigantic voter identification, voter turnout effort. And then we stopped doing it after 20 some odd years and got away from it. And as a result, we came close. We lost seats in the Texas House. We lost congressional seats. We came close to losing statewide races for the first time since 1994. And so we started doing things different in 2020. And one of the things we did was under the radar, without making a big deal about it, without beating our chests so the Democrats knew what we were doing, we went out and registered 212,000 new Republican voters and then turned them out.
Wow.
And the Democrats did an autopsy and they said, we don't know how, we don't know why, but the Republicans out-registered us. In fact, they out-registered us by a net of 88,000 more Republicans than Democrats in just the last 3 months of the election cycle alone. So you've got to be involved in voter registration, voter contact, door to door, knocking on doors, introducing yourself, having volunteers get out the vote. I mean, this is critical. And data helps us. The amount of data that we have today that allows us to target persuadable suburban independents and persuadable Hispanics and low propensity Republicans, all the data and modeling that we have available to us today helps us pinpoint our mail, our phone, our texting, and our personal contact. But we got to do it. So those three things: have a message, a proactive, positive message, raise as much as you can and hold on to it as long as you can, and have a comprehensive ground game in which the candidate himself or herself participates. Nothing is as powerful as the candidate knocking on the right door saying, hi, I'm Joe Smith or Susie Jones. I'd like to have your vote. And we got to be doing all three.
What's a mistake that you think Democrats have already made or will make this cycle that their opponents should capitalize on?
Well, they got the wrong priorities. So let's capitalize on it by having the right priorities. So President Biden went yesterday, Tuesday, the 11th of January, to Atlanta to make a huge speech about what he called voter suppression, which most people don't view as voter suppression. But that's also the day before he got the largest bad inflation report in 40 years. So we got to stay focused on talking about, let them go to talk about the things they want to talk about. We got to talk about the things that matter to people, which is what's happening around the kitchen table, what's happening to the family budget, how good is my job, what kind of prospects do my kids have to have a good life, what are the values in our neighborhood and our community, what's the safety and security of our neighborhood, what are the values that we prize as Americans, are they being respected by our elected officials or not? All of those are ripe for us to do. If we spend more time worried about getting that message out to the voters and less time about beating up on the other side, we'll be better off. Sure, we're going to beat up on the other side, but we got to spend more time talking about what we're for.
Based on the Democrats' devastating losses in both Virginia and New Jersey this past year, how are you predicting they try to offset Republican momentum to mitigate those losses in 2022? Because you can already tell Democrats are stressed and they know that they're probably going to lose lots.
Yeah, I think they're going to make a big mistake in doing what Biden did this week, and that is going to Georgia and trying to pump up the hard left of the Democratic Party. He was accusing, for example, the Georgians were responsible for Jim Crow 2.0 and voter suppression and election subversion. And I thought it was interesting. The first thing he did was he said, well, they in Georgia, they made it harder for you to vote absentee. Well, it's easier to vote absentee by mail in Georgia than it is in New York State. In Georgia, anybody can vote early in the state. No excuse, early voting. Just send in an application. They send you an absentee ballot. In New York, if you want to vote absentee by mail, you have to apply for the application. You have to send in an application for it, but you can only do it if you're going to be out of town on election day, physically ill, disabled, a patient in a VA hospital, or in a jail for a non-felony charge. But anybody else, if you don't fit that, you can't vote. So Georgia somehow under Biden is, a racist backwater, and New York is, well, not mentioned at all. So I think they're going to make a mistake by trying to do things that appeal to the hard left of the Democratic Party, which means they don't really have much impact on the independents and swing voters who are going to decide the election. The other thing is, I think they're going to make a mistake of thinking that this is having made the mistake that it's going to be a base election. I think they're also going to make the mistake of trying to make this all about Trump, 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 Trump. And we saw this in Virginia. The Democrats said, Glenn Youngkin is, Trump in a fleece. But Youngkin had done enough to establish himself, and people said, no, he's not Trump in a fleece. He's Glenn Youngkin in a fleece. And so as a result, all of this time and energy and effort spent attacking him as a Trump light just went sort of straight past the ordinary voter. And they said, that doesn't matter to me because he's clearly his own man. So I think that's the other thing that they're going to make a mistake about. They will have advantages, though. Don't underestimate their ability to spend money. 2020, not a single Republican Senate candidate in a competitive race was able to outspend his opponent. And that's going to happen again. Here in Texas, in the state legislative races, most of our state legislators were in competitive races were outspent by their Democratic opponents, and yet the Republicans won. And it was because they did it smarter and they had sufficient funds, even if they didn't have more funds.
In 2020, I think they spent collectively about $500 million on state level races. And then in 2021, they definitely outspent Republicans.
Huge. Yeah.
Do you think that they're going to be able to spend their way to victory in 2022?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's, again, in politics, it's not having, if you're having the most money made you the victor, we'd be talking about President, Bloomberg today. The political battlefront is littered with the corpses of wealthy candidates who spent more money or candidates who outraised money. I mean, think about it. Lindsey Graham, his opponent spent $110 million in South Carolina, and Jaime Harrison came up short. Same thing happened here in Texas. John Cornyn is outspent by MJ Hager and wallops her by 10 points. So I mean, having the most money doesn't necessarily guarantee you victory. But if you're going to come up short on that, you got to spend what you got wisely and at the right time and in the right way.
That's a great segue into one of my last questions. So you've worked with RSLC for quite some time now. Why do you think that we're one of the wisest investments that you can make if you're looking to donate to an organization that makes, real impact?
Well, RSLC is the farm team. The people who get elected to the state house and state senate and to the statewide lower constitutional offices tend to be the future of the party. They tend to be the people who, when the open congressional seat comes up, they run for it, or when that statewide office comes open, they run for it, or maybe they think about running for the Senate. But it's also where it's the center of diversity in our party. I think one of the great successes that the RSLC had in 2021, and I think it will be one of their great successes in 2022, is to make a special effort to support women, veteran, Hispanic, Asian American, and African American candidates and young candidates. All of that helps broaden the appeal of the Republican Party and prepare us to be the 21st century majority party.
All right. Well, this is my last question. It's a little bit more fun, but what's one piece of advice you'd tell people who want to do what you want to do?
Well, interesting question. I'd say roll with the punches. I remember all these kids that I was in college Republicans with who said, I'm going to be in the state house by 25, and 28, I'll be in the state Senate, and then this congressional seat, I'll run for Congress when I'm 32. Life doesn't have a way of working out that way, and at all. And so my advice, I was asked a similar question at the end of the class I was teaching this past fall at UT. Somebody said, what should I do if I want to be active in politics? I said, first of all, you ought to get a degree, and you ought to get a degree in something that interests you, and start a career. Move to where you want to be, where you want to live, and start a career. If you want to be a lawyer, fine. If you want to be an engineer, fine. If you want to be a small business person, fine. But go start it. Go start your life in a place that you want to be, and save time for politics. Get your feet wet in your career, develop some expertise, and build yourself and move forward, and get some money. And strange things will happen. You might actually fall in love, get married, and start a family. But be where you want to be, and save time for politics. Get involved in the local campaigns, and get involved in your local party, and this was a class of students at UT, whether it's Democrat or Republican. And then if the opportunity arises, plunge in and do it. But have a life, and have a life where you want to where it is that you want to live. I mean, I can't imagine living anywhere else other than Texas. And as a result, I've had a wonderful career in politics that I couldn't have had if I'd stayed in Washington, D.C. I grew up in the West. I was working in Washington, D.C. By accident ended up coming to Texas, and I love it here, and I can't imagine being anyplace else. And yet I've had all kinds of opportunities as a result of not being, so methodical when something was going to happen in my life, but rolling with the punches and taking advantage of the opportunities that I was given. Love that.
So do you have any final thoughts for our listeners today?
Contribute generously, frequently to the RSLC. Was that what I was supposed to say? You gave me, I still got the $20 you gave me to say something about that. So I hope I don't have to give it back, because it's all the cash I got right here. But anyway, thanks to everybody for listening. And seriously, if you're a supporter of RSLC, thank you so much for helping this great organization do the good work that it does. I'm honored to serve on its board as a volunteer and to help them raise money. And I do so because I got plenty of other things I could do. I do it because I think this is a good group doing vital work for our party. And I really appreciate the leadership and the staff and the hard work that they put in on this activity.
Karl, I know I can speak for our entire staff when I say that we definitely appreciate you. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. And thanks everybody for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform that you're listening on. And always remember that state politics have implications that are bigger than you think.